let's start. So we came in government with Itamar Franco after Collor. He was the vice president after the impeachment, and it started a lot of progressive, I'll not say reforms, but measures, including the real. After we had Cardoso, Lula, Dilma, and Itamar. Difference among themselves, but all of them fall to the dictatorship, and all of them have some progressist ideas. So 1 year ago, St. Anthony College in Oxford asked me to come here to say how Bolsonaro was elected. I said, I will not say how he won. I accept to come to Oxford to say how we lost. The Democrats, progressists, the left. Why? And after 1 year of this lecture, I published a small book, e-book. It's not printed. It's at Amazon. How the left elected the right in Brazil. I want to say that that's happening in many other countries, including Europe. So why? I put in the book 24 reasons, 24 mistakes we made. I'll not have the time to talk about them. Let me say one or two. I think that the most important is that we did not take on account the changes in the world. The limits to growth for ecological reasons. We need a new kind of development. And we kept it, the same idea of increasing consumption, not to improve in quality of life, for example. Robotics, we did not take on account that the progress today no more create jobs, just the opposite. The fifth, the sixth, the progress created jobs. Now, it abolished jobs. We did not take that on account. How to do as a left person in a world where progress finished jobs. We did not take on account that the workers, they are now divided, and they have no more the same interests as the grassroots of people, the poor. There is a difference. So we lost syntony, tone with the change in the world. I used to say that we did not remark the turn of history in the last 20, 30 years. The second is that we begin to be populists and too much concerned with election and no concern with philosophy, no concern with new ideas. Even because the universities and the intellectuals during these 26 years, they were silent. We mix university and politics in the sense of parts, not in the sense of global policies and the politics. We received no new ideas for a new kind of development, a new kind of progress. So we had bad politicians and no philosophers. Philosophers in the sense of economists, sociologists, and so on. That was a terrible mistake. We made a mistake also because we lost utopia. The left has to have utopian projects. We have no more. After what happened in the East Europe with the socialism, we did not put another proposition on the table to discuss. What did you do during this period to promote a new kind of utopia? And to me, In the case of Brazil, the utopia is good education for everybody. And the same quality of education independent of the income of the family. We should do that, and you did not do that. We even increased the number of students in universities. Yes, we did that. We did good things, let me say. One was this, but we did not change basic education. We have the same terrible quality and the same inequality among the education of a poor child and a rich child. We had no utopia. And this is why the only thing that put us together today is to be against Bolsonaro. And it's important that. But we have to think, and after Bolsonaro, we have no proposition to after Bolsonaro, but no Bolsonaro. That's not enough. We need that. That's not enough. So I published this book. In Portuguese, the title was quite different. In Portuguese, the title was Why We Failed. Por que falhamos? Why we failed. In English, it doesn't make sense, this idea. So the title is How the Left Elected the Right in Brazil. And I'm glad to be here to try to discuss and to talk about the others 24 mistakes. And I hope you go to the Amazon and you can find it. But if you prefer, do not spend this $4. I can send each one of you by PDF. It's like that. I can send by PDF to you, not a Kindle. And I would like very much to be in touch after to leave from here, discussing this idea. Why? Why? After 26 years of a bloc, Democrats, progressists, left, and center-right, we lost to the worst kind of president that we have now, a rightist. I'll not say fascist, but a rightist against the improvement that we had during these last years in the way the society has to be organized, the rights of the minorities is against, and even perhaps, we don't know yet, against the program of income transfer to poor people. Not yet. Up to now, it's kept, but we don't know. But against Indians, against the Amazon, we have to be against himself, but we need to go ahead after him. And today, the left has no proposition in Brazil but to take Bolsonaro out. We need that, but it's not enough. I'd be glad to discuss all of that with you today, if you have time, and after that, through emails and the other social medias. Thank you very much for being here, and I'm ready to discuss these 2-3 errors, mistakes I said, and the other others that I think we made during these 26 years in power. In a way, I say we, because I was part of that. I was elected 2-time senator, I was governor, I was rector of a university, the Brasilia University. I was minister of Lula for 1 year only, that's true. So I am part of this group, but I will not accept to keep silent with the mistakes that we made. Thank you very much for being here, and let's discuss these ideas.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I would start saying that, to me, it seems to me that Cristovam Buarque is relatively generous when he says we, because At the beginning of this story, as he mentioned, the progressive politics in Brazil were in power. There were alliances of different political sectors, but with this point in common, the commitment to change the social inequality tradition of Brazilian society. So in this sense, we call ourselves, everybody, progressive political forces in the country. But inside the political forces, right at the beginning, for example, at the second part of the first term of President Lula, some of us started disagreeing with some adaptation. So my talk here, to provoke the debate, is going to be, is going to focus on the main shortcomings of both the theoretical and the practice of the progressive politics in Brazil during this period. Because I don't think that it was a homogeneous attitude agreeing with everything that happened in this period, particularly after the presidency of Lula in 2002. So, it's, I have to put here, yeah. So, why the Brazilian left failed to anticipate great threats to democracy, the threats that we are seeing everywhere, here in Europe, in India, in South America, in the United States with Trump. So these new phenomena, particularly accelerated by the information technology revolution and the way that people now take part in the international arena of politics. So we didn't anticipate the problem of right-wing conservative populism. That's one point. We didn't manage to defeat the old tradition of Brazilian bureaucracy, who stifles both civil society and economic entrepreneurs. So we didn't adapt to the fake news and the disinformation potential. And in the case of Bolsonarism, for example, they were well ahead using this new technology. So they produce a lot of fake news. They start developing a campaign model based in disinformation, based in fake news, based in intense use of social media. Corruption and crime, that's an old tradition, as you know, you who studies Brazilian history, you know, that's a strong, unfortunately, feature of Brazilian history. But what happened with the progressive political forces in this period? At the beginning, they adapted to this kind of corrupt electoral system, corrupt functioning of Brazilian bureaucracy. Then, I would say, these political forces, unfortunately, developed also because the size of the state sector, for example, if you take the case of Petrobras, which produced the scandal of Petrolão, with the discovery of the pre-salt, the amount of oil and revenues were very high. So corruption in the progressive politics developed in a higher proportion, huge amount of unprecedented corruption in the state sectors together with the Brazilian politics. So that was another shortcoming. To take the corrupt political system, so the electoral system produced this kind. In the beginning, it was the need to finance the political campaigns. Then we, unfortunately, could testimony people, even in the left, even in the progressive politics, taking money from the from the politics and taking money from themselves. So it was something that it is in one of the pillars to the disenchantment of the Brazilian electorate with progressive political forces. So first mensalão in 2006, 2005, 2006. So the second part of the first term of President Lula. Then Petrolão, and now the investigation by public prosecutors, by the judges, Sérgio Moro, we have heard of him. So the Lava Jato. So the elections of 2018 was developed with the backdrop of these huge scandals, provoking all the rejection of the forces that were in power and that were doing this kind of malpractice. Another point is, although we have the period of President Lula reducing inequality with Bolsa Familia, Luiz is studying here this topic, and other of you are studying this topic as well. So there was a reduction of inequality. But we didn't make the strong structural reforms that were indispensable to tackle the problem of economic inequality. So if we were giving some handouts, Cristovam Buarque was the guy who started this program of making the conditionality of the handout for the poverty, the poor, but conditional to attendance to school. He made this point right at the beginning of the government of President Lula, and as a governor of the state of Federal with Bolsa Escola, he has introduced this kind of scheme of conditionality. Because for him, for us, and for you, education is much more strategic than just a ladder for individual improvement in society. So I think that we, the progressive, we failed to overcome deeply rooted economic inequality. We failed to make the structural reforms that were a condition to tackle the historical inequality of Brazilian society. And also, I would say, I don't know if it's because we come from a poor region in Brazil, Northeast region. I come from the state of Pernambuco. In Northeast, as you know, is the poorest region of the country. So the regional imbalance, Maruki doctor, who is here, she's a specialist in the theory of development. So this kind of imbalance between the different regions in the country. I know that we have here, for example, I could read about all the boosts that the governments here in Britain tried to give to the region of Newcastle, for example, here to the area, all right? A bit further. So regional inequalities were not addressed as they should have been addressed. So just to give an idea, during the government of President Lula, pre-crisis 2014, so part of the government of Dilma Rousseff as well. So we have the share of the 40% poorer increasing by 10%. The 40 is in this graph. And the wealthier were doing less well. So it was a moment, we have to stress that it was a moment of reducing inequalities, but in a very superficial way. That was the point. And then, after the crisis of 2014, so who were the penalized? The poor. The poor lost 22% of their income, the 40% poor. So if you take the whole period, you see still the situation of the poor getting worse, which would be something that we wouldn't expect after a period of hegemony of the progressive political forces. So the coefficient Gini, so you see here, 2012 until 24, it was reducing, so inequality was reducing, and then with the crisis, and there is no point in saying, oh, it's here because here you had, after Dilma Rousseff, President Temer, it would be the responsible. Of course, we know the result was a result of the factor of the bad economic policy, which produced this huge crisis, minus 7% of GDP in a short period of time. So I argue the Brazilian left failed to change Brazilian backward institutions. So bureaucracy, so as a hinder for effectiveness of both social policies and economic activity and entrepreneurship. So the bureaucracy stifles all the capacity of initiative of Brazilian society. That's an old problem, but after this period of progressive politics, one should assume that this main hindrance to the development of the country should have been addressed by progressive politics. And we failed to do that. So the perverse incentives, inefficiency everywhere. So that's something that, in the end, penalize the poorest. That's the point. It's not a matter of right-wing or left-wing. Objectively, if you don't tackle those hindrances, who pay the count, who pay the bill, must be the poor. So it's not something that a progressive political government should be comfortable to do. So the Brazilian left failed to create sound economic environment. So there was a number of macro and microeconomic small changes that could have been done. We tried to pressure on that, but anyway, the adaptation to the scheme failed to do this kind of change, which would produce more jobs, more income, and more development to all the social sectors in the Brazilian society. Brazilian left failed to foresee the threats to liberty and democracy. So while everywhere there were this kind of threats, Trump in Hungary, in Poland, now in India, so everywhere, in Turkey, in Russia. So this kind of right-wing populism using the social media, it was rising. It was a wave, and the Brazilian left didn't pay attention to such a phenomenon. Yes, I like this observation of Mário Vargas Llosa when he says, maybe Yuval Harari has a point on that, that it is in the DNA of mankind, the attitude of group, to take part in small groups. And then so we have an atavic tendency to follow the charismatic leader of the group. So we didn't understand that, and we didn't take precaution of left-wing populism. So we are all the time, President Lula, he's the guy. Even Obama said that. In Davos, what was the economic forum that he was there? Obama said, Lula, he called other chief of state and said, this is the guy, even Obama. So everybody was making a kind of, fancied by the charisma of the leader, because it's something that it is inside mankind, inside all of us. So we were less critical than we should be done, that we should have been towards President Lula. I myself, I very much included. I was the leader, the whip of the Workers' Party parliamentarian group in his government during a period. And I thought, my God, this guy is going to conduct the country to social justice, to development, to another kind of society. It was a dream for us. So we lose our critical attitude. And we, as academics, maybe we have a double guilt, because an academic has to be very critical, analytical, what's happening. And we were taking part, and we failed to see the shortcomings of our leader, of President Lula. This kind of a tribal spirit, which contaminates politics everywhere nowadays. The Brazilian left failed to foresee these threats of liberty, so we can go that, I have already mentioned. Left-wing populism, 2 minutes, so let's go ahead. So the point is, does Bolsonaro threaten democracy? Why this question arises? Because we see the political character of several figures in the cabinet, very right-wing people. I quote just the example here. To take care of human rights, this lady is unbelievably, not to say this, the less to say that she does understand what means human rights policy, to say the least, all right? So if you take every example, this guy, I was a friend of him, not a friend, a mate, during 12 years in parliament. He's ashamed. He's ashamed. And he is the chief of staff of President Bolsonaro. So those people, we lived together with them. It's unbelievable that they are in charge of such a big country, such a sophisticated society with all the problems as the Brazilian one. So because of this feature of the composition of the government, of the cabinet of President Bolsonaro, people say, democracy is under threat. That's the big question. Liberal economic policies. So for some people, those are threats because some people think pension reform is going to penalize the poorest, but other people understand that something has to be done to make the system sustainable, affordable to the Brazilian state. Attacks, every day you see in the social media, in the traditional media outlets, some kind of attack to the environment, to indigenous people's rights. For example, now he's proposing to allow mining in the indigenous, the native people lands. So this kind of attacks to human rights activists, so taking all the social councils that were developed in the progressive era, now they are destroying these initial improvements that we experienced in the period. Attacks to press freedom, tough stance on crime, relaxing controls, promote everybody has to have his or her own gun, so this kind of attitude. Undermining Sérgio Moro, who is fighting corruption. So now the point is, there are a lot of hints between the president's family and the militias. Now we are talking about what's happening this week there. The boost to evangelical church, giving privilege to the communications outlets of the evangelical church, this kind of attitude which undermines the laicity of the Brazilian state. And a very poor capacity of coordination in Congress. So this is the government that suffered more defeats in the bills that the government is proposing to to Congress than any other government in the recent Brazilian history, political history.
Can you stop there? I mean to stop you there so we can get into questions. Is that okay? Can you wrap up?
Okay, then I mentioned that, no problem.
Cool. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Through the magic of social media, I've been informed we can actually run slightly over on this session. Where some of you have a meeting at 1:15, but we can run until roughly then. So with that in mind, firstly, thank you for two very comprehensive presentations. I don't really want to ask you complex questions. I do want to try and draw out a bit more of the discussion with one question each. So, Cristovam, I found your point. Your presentation was really interesting overall, but the point where you said that workers have now become separated from the poor, I would like you to expand a bit more on what you meant by that, because it's been described in various different ways, particularly people reading recent publications by, I think, Alfredo Saad-Filho would say it's the middle class distancing themselves from the very poor, and other commentators might say it's the poor maybe encroaching on the territory of the more well-off. So can you just expand for us what you mean by that relationship between the workers and the poor?
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you a question so you have a chance to think about it. That was really good. That was a really comprehensive presentation, so thank you for that. But rather than go into it point by point, what stands out about it is you're describing a failure to engage in state reform. Well, in a very broad aspect, that's what it sounds like. In the regional context of Latin America, obviously that's very interesting, because one of the things that PT was quite heralded for was that it wasn't engaging in the radical changes that we saw in places like Bolivia and Venezuela, where they really did try and reform the state. So to clarify, is it that type of path of reform that we're talking about, or something of a different character? And if I can append a sub-point to that, Dilma Rousseff did attempt to have a more radical passage of reform, particularly reform of the economy after 2012, which collapsed. So could you speak to that briefly in response? I'm going to give you a minute each to speak to that, a couple of minutes. Is that okay?
Yes.
Cool. So if you could lead us off, please.
There is something that have been discussed for many, many years in Brazil among my students. The idea that we have no more workers and capitalists. We have workers inside the modern system. We have the capitalists, and we have the third group, excluded, the poor people. And in some moments, there is a cooperation in the agreement among workers, organized workers, the unions, and the capitalists against the poor. For example, these workers here, they have support, to public support to pay private school to the children. And these people here, excluded, they have just public schools. Very, very bad public schools. The drivers in public system transportation, sometimes they need an agreement with the capitalists to increase the tariff of transportation against these people here. This is the thing that we, the left in Brazil, didn't understand. We still are working politically with the workers, the organized workers, the sophisticated workers, especially in the public sector. So we did not care about poor people, but with some income transfer, with some programs, good programs by Dilma Rousseff, for example, to bring Cuban doctors to Brazil, that was good. A program of housing, but even housing program was not to these people here, it was to these people here, down perhaps, not here. This is the idea. The class struggle in Brazil, I have been saying that for 30 years. The class struggle is three actors fighting, not just two. And how to bring these people out? There is just one way. The same school to everybody, public school to everybody. Abolishing finance private school and keeping the subsidies directly to public schools. This is the revolution that I can see in Brazil. Europe did that some years ago, 2 centuries ago. In this country, not so long time ago. This is our revolutionary perspective today. Education, the same, and with equality to everybody. But these people here, the workers, they are not fighting for public schools. They are fighting for subsidies to private schools. And they had a lot. So this is the idea, the struggle with the two kind of mais-valia. How to say that in mais-valia?
Surplus
Surplus,
yeah.
surplus, two kind. These people here, capitalists doing surplus against the workers, and both of them against the poor.
Okay. Cool. Thank you very much. And
So my point is that the kind of state reform that was done or led by President Dilma Rousseff was very different from the kind of state reform that we need. She had an approach, a very interventionist approach. She developed the so-called new economic matrix, which produced a disaster in terms of jobs. 40 million jobs were lost with those policies, with this kind of interventionist. And when people said, President, what are you doing? No, that's because of the international economic crisis. The old habit of put the blame other person. So that's not the state reform that we are advocating. We'd like a kind of state reform producing more effectiveness for social policies. Create a sound economic environment. So boosting individual and companies and third sector economic entrepreneurship. So make people less dependent from the state. This kind of modern reform, this kind of approach that I think that we missed to do. Then we produce this kind of crisis. And just to make a complementation, because I didn't calculate it well my time, I'd like to say that these results produced a kind of analysis that some people said, oh, Brazil is on the verge now, because of the ascension of Bolsonarism. Some people say Brazil is on the verge of the end of democracy. There is this tradition, Levitsky, Yasha Monk. So some people they say, my God, because those people are right-wing people, Brazil is on the verge of ending democracy. Because some people, the president himself, they are not democratic people in their mind. But the checks and balances, the strength of civil society, the functioning with all the problems of Brazilian institutions. If you take some checks, for example, if you take, there are elections. There are defeats of the government in parliament, there are. There are some rulings by the Supreme Court against the government, there are. The press is criticizing the government, is criticizing. Public demonstrations are forbidden, are not. So some objective measures of the functioning of democracy are in place in Brazil. Even if we have some people in government who don't care to democracy. So it's different. It's different. So that's my point. And some people say, no, there is no risk of democracy because this kind of functioning of society and the institutions. And now, a quick hint on what are the prospects. What are the prospects for the election in 2022? Now we will hold elections, municipal elections. So some movements, but those movements are not definitive for the presidential elections in 2022. Now what we have in the Brazilian society, we have less than 1/3 influenced by the so-called Lulopetismo. We have roughly 1/3 taking part in the Bolsonarist movement, and we have 1/3 who are not comfortable with the mistakes committed by the progressive politics, by the governments led by the PT, by the Workers' Party, by my former party, and another third who, this third who is not comfortable with Bolsonarism, is not comfortable neither with Lulopetismo nor Bolsonarism. So there is a space to reinventing progressivism. That's the theme of my book, of this book. How can we reinvent progressivism? First, make the diagnosis. Then, what are the policies and the change of political culture and attitudes that we are proposing to reinvent progressivism, if there is a scope for that? And I am one of the believers that I don't believe we are on the verge of dictatorship, of ending democracy. And I do believe that there is a scope for people from different political traditions to reinvent the change that we have to do, the path that we have to do to tackle the old problems of Brazilian society.